Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. I'm Stuart Warner, director of the forum and also a professor of philosophy. Our speaker today is Professor Catherine Zuckert. I've known her for several decades, and as I was just speaking to her, I said, you know, you're a very hard woman to introduce. And she said, it's not so hard. I was born, I did stuff, and I went downhill. She has surely not gone downhill. Professor Zuckert received her undergraduate degree from Cornell University. She then went on to the University of Chicago for graduate studies. She wrote her dissertation on Friedrich Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations under Leo Strauss, and she has spent the last, I won't say how many years, but a good number of years writing works that exhibit the most breathtaking insight and felicity of prose that one can ever hope to find. My favorite book of hers is on natural right and the American imagination, political philosophy, in a novel form, which is a double entendre, novel, which I sort of like. That's a book of some 280 pages. That's vastly her thinnest book. She then tended toward books that exceed 400 pages, 500 pages, 600 pages. She has a book on Machiavelli's politics, one on Plato's Philosophers, one on postmodern Plato's that deals with Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, Gadamer, and Leo Strauss. This is not the first time that Professor Zuckert has lectured at Roosevelt. The first time was more years ago than either one of us would like to admit. It was a conference on Friedrich Nietzsche and Plato, and Professor Zuckert spoke early in the conference, and as the organizer of the meeting, I was thrilled because it was brilliant and people were excited, and I couldn't wait for the rest of the conference to consider along the same track. And then I walked past one of the restrooms, and the next speaker had come out, and it looked as if she were crying. She was all set to speak on Plato and animals in Plato's dialogues, and I asked her, what's wrong? She said, how can you possibly expect me to follow that? You'll notice on this occasion, no one will follow Professor Zuckert. She is our only speaker, and she is more than sufficient for the occasion. Currently, she has two positions. She's the Nancy Reeves Dreux Professor of Political Philosophy at Notre Dame, and she's also a professor at Arizona State University. More importantly, today she's a speaker at the Montesquieu Forum, and she'll be speaking on Descartes' revolutionary project. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zuckert.
That's a pretty nice introduction for somebody who said he didn't know what to say. As those of you in Professor Warner's class know, Descartes' Discourse on Method is a strange book. The title, whether in its usual abbreviated form or in its full form, Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth in the Sciences, leads readers to expect that it will constitute a treatise, if not a handbook, on argumentative method and evidence or proof, something like Aristotle's Posterior Analytics or books on logic by Hegel or John Stuart Mill. In fact, however, only one of the 6 parts of the discourse contains a brief description of the method Descartes is introducing. Most of the work contains an autobiographical account of the experiences that led him to develop an entirely new way of reasoning and a brief summary of the results. Moreover, having insisted repeatedly, in fact, at the beginning of the book, that he sought a new mode of inquiry only for himself and warning others away from imitating him, he concludes by promising that the use of this method will produce very great benefits for all human beings if others support and assist him. The discourse is thus a discourse on the utility of the method of rightly conducting one's reason and of seeking truth in the sciences that Descartes had discovered, rather than a demonstration of the method and its results. Why did Descartes present his revolutionary discovery so modestly and indirectly? Toward the end of the discourse, he explains that learning about the trial of Galileo, he had decided not to publish a manuscript in which he had explained the use and results of his method more fully. Although he claims he had not argued anything contrary to the Roman Catholic faith, he was evidently worried about the church suppressing his writings, which the Pope officially did 13 years after Descartes' death by putting them on the index. The discourse thus became the first book Descartes published, and as he repeatedly states, he wanted to avoid scholarly controversies, but he wasn't quite that lucky. He wrote the discourse in French rather than in Latin, the language of the schools, to appeal to a broader audience. And in it, he initially presents his decision to scrap the Jesuit education he initially received in order to find a new way of seeking knowledge as one taken solely for his own benefit. Descartes does not initially urge anyone to imitate or copy him because, or at least that's what I would argue, he understood full well that he was in fact advocating the overthrow and jettisoning of the way in which Europeans had been seeking knowledge for more than 2 millennia. His project was apt to be opposed, therefore, not solely by the church authorities, but by established university faculty and administrators, and it was. Worried more generally about appearing to be a young, extremely arrogant upstart, Descartes begins the discourse by paraphrasing an old adage, and I quote, in the English translation, of course. Good sense must be the best distributed thing in the world because everyone thinks he is well provided for it, with it, so that even those who are most difficult to content in all other things do not customarily desire more than they have. Since everyone is satisfied with what they have, he reasons, the power of judging well and of distinguishing the true from the false must be what is naturally equal in all. We have diverse opinions, not because some are more reasonable than others, but only because we conduct our thoughts by different ways and do not consider the same things. Descartes, rather ironically, does not begin his discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason by providing his readers with a good example of it. His conclusion that the power of judging well and reasoning is equal does not logically follow from the fact that everyone thinks that he or she is the best judge of his or her own interests. Many human beings observedly make bad judgments about what will benefit them. The attachment most human beings display to their own opinions of what is good and bad for them, as Hobbes points out, is the reason we don't readily accept the judgments of others, especially when they are forced upon us. And we must, therefore, be persuaded to consent to government. Descartes may not be demonstrating his excellence of reasoning here, but he is exhibiting his understanding that no author will convince his readers to accept his views by beginning by insulting their intelligence. He thus begins his discourse by maintaining that he is not arrogantly claiming to have a better mind than others. He states that he merely had the good fortune during his youth to have fallen upon certain paths, accidentally led by chance into certain considerations, which led him to formulate certain maxims, which in turn enabled him to augment his knowledge little by little to the highest point to which the mediocrity of his mind, that's why he's so famous as a philosopher, and the short duration of his life would allow. He is happy to describe these paths. But contrary to the suggestion readers may have taken from the title of his treatise, he does not intend to teach the method each should follow to conduct his or her reason well. He will, in quotes, show only in what fashion he has tried to conduct his own. Indeed, he acknowledges his example may prove harmful to some. As Descartes proceeds to relate the reasons he became disillusioned with his Jesuit education and thinks he has acquired a better way of acquiring knowledge on his own, it becomes clear he does not think that he or his reason is merely the equal of any other. He had entered college believing that he could acquire a clear and assured knowledge of all that is useful for life with an extreme desire to learn. But after having proved himself as good or better a student, studying under some of the finest professors in one of the best colleges in France, he found that he was left with so many doubts and errors that his education had no other benefit but to show him his ignorance. If that statement reminds you of the famous claim Plato's Socrates makes at his trial, that the Delphic oracle declared that no one was wiser than he, it isn't an accident. By interrogating other human beings who claimed to be wise and discovering that they were not, Socrates concluded that he at least knew that he did not know or understand the most important things. He was literally a philosopher, that is, a seeker of knowledge rather than one who possessed it. The scholastic education Descartes had received at La Flèche incorporated such an understanding of philosophy, which had been incorporated into Christian theology through the works of Augustine and Aquinas. In his discourse, Descartes thus announces, in effect, that he did not want to continue seeking without ever finding something he could know for sure, as philosophers had for centuries, because their search hadn't produced any knowledge that was useful for life. So after graduating from college, Descartes resolved to seek no other science but that which could be found in himself or in the great book of the world. Beginning with the world, he traveled in order to meet people of diverse humors and conditions. Finding almost as much diversity in the morals of other men as he had in philosophers, he thought he derived the greatest profit from seeing that other great nations had held many opinions he and his contemporaries deemed ridiculous. He learned not to believe anything of which he had been persuaded only by example or by custom, and gradually liberated himself from many of the errors that prevent human beings from listening to reason. Then he decided to study within himself. However, in contrast to Augustine, whose Confessions some of you have read in the course, Descartes did not find the confused thoughts and desires with which the bishops struggled. Having decided to doubt everything, Descartes found that he could not doubt that he was doubting, and that meant he could not doubt that he existed. He concluded, therefore, that this first piece of undeniably true, clear, and distinct thought should constitute the first principle of the certain knowledge he was seeking. Descartes doesn't present his rejection of all received opinions as an example he would advise anyone to imitate, however. On the contrary, he observes, the world is almost entirely composed of two kinds of minds, for whom such an endeavor is thoroughly unsuitable. First, there are those who, believing themselves more competent than they are, cannot help making precipitate judgments and lack enough patience to conduct all their thoughts in an orderly way, so that once they have taken the liberty to doubt received opinions and depart from the common path, they are lost for the rest of their lives. Second, there are also those who, having enough reason or modesty to judge that they are less capable of distinguishing the true from the false, so much for the equality, than some others by whom they can be instructed, these must be content to follow the opinions of these others. And Descartes modestly declares that he would have been one of these followers if he had had a single teacher. But at the Jesuit college where he studied, he had had many teachers who disagreed with one another. So after emphasizing the role of fortune in his discovery, Part 2, Descartes describes the circumstances and thoughts which led him to conceive the unprecedented path he would take. Returning from Germany with the Dutch mercenary army, in which he had enlisted probably as a medic, he found himself alone in a heated room, this very famous incident, without any conversation to divert him and without cares or passions to disturb his thoughts. And he reflected. There is less perfection in works of several pieces made by the hand of diverse masters than in those at which one alone has worked. There is, for example, greater beauty and order to be found in buildings designed by a single architect. Cities planned by an engineer are more reasonably arranged than those which have grown up helter-skelter over time. The religion made by God alone is superior to all others. And like Sparta, cities are better governed by laws designed by a single legislator than polities whose laws are a jumble of accretions over time. However, Descartes also emphasizes the difference between the relatively small acts of individuals who tear down their houses in order to build a better one, and the risk of total destruction in attempts to reform entire states or schools of thought. In other words, he does not want to appear to be a potentially destructive reformer of the state and its laws, religion, or thought. He began, therefore, by looking back at the only sciences he thought he had provided students with certain knowledge and might thus contribute something useful to his endeavor. He concluded that syllogistic logic was useful in persuading others of what one had discovered, but not in discovering or learning new things too. So not that. Moreover, he would have to modify the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns in order to extend mathematics to less abstract and useful problems. And in attempting to do so, he again thought that a multitude of laws often furnishes excuses to the vices, and that states are much better regulated when they have only a few that are strictly observed. So he formulated a mere 4 laws to regulate his own inquiries. First, never to accept anything as true that he did not know evidently to be so, because it presented itself so clearly and distinctly to his mind that he would have no occasion to doubt it. Second, to divide each of the difficulties he examined into as many parts as possible in order to resolve it better. Third, to conduct his thoughts in order, beginning with the objects that are simplest and easiest to know, in order to ascend little by little to the more complex. And finally, to make such complete enumerations and such general reviews that he would be assured of having omitted nothing. The long chains of reasoning geometers use in their most difficult demonstrations persuaded Descartes that all human knowledge can be shown to be interconnected in the same way, provided that one abstains from accepting anything as true that is not, and always adheres to the order required to deduce them one from another. And that is basically the scientific method connected to geometry in ways I think people still learn in high school, at least I did. Descartes sought first to test and practice his method in the only studies through which he had been able to attain certain knowledge, those mathematics. And observing that all mathematical sciences considered nothing but the diverse relations or proportions found in their particular objects, he examined these proportions and found that he could represent them more distinctly to his imagination by holding them by supposing them to hold between lines. To retain and comprehend them in general, he also found it necessary to invent a new form of notation. And this combined the best of both algebra and geometry. And by applying his method, Descartes discovered not only that he could quickly solve many of the mathematical problems, he also had developed a means of approaching questions of which he had been previously ignorant. However, so long as he remained uncertain in his judgments about the truth of things, Descartes realized he needed some practical guidelines concerning his actions. In addition to his method of inquiry, he thus formulated a provisional morality for himself. Not surprisingly, in light of his stated desire not to be perceived as a revolutionary, the first of these maxims was to obey the laws and customs of his country, adhering constantly to the religion in which God gave him the grace to be instructed from childhood, and governing himself in everything else according to the most moderate opinions commonly received and practiced by those he was living with. Nevertheless, Descartes emphasizes in concluding, this morality was provisional, considering, and I quote, all the promises by which we abandon something of our freedom excessive, so freedom is extremely important to him, not seeing anything in the world that remains always in the same state, and proposing to perfect his judgments, he thought he would violate common sense if he held himself obliged to approve something good after he had determined that it was not. So he was open to change his mind. That's the first principle. Follow what's being done, except when you find out you don't agree with it. Second, since the actions of life do not permit of any delay, Descartes resolved to follow even his most doubtful opinion in practice once he had decided upon it. When it is not in our power to discern the truest opinions, he contends, we ought to follow the most probable because the reason that has made us choose them is itself true and certain. Third, he declared that he would be content if he tried always to conquer himself rather than fortune, to change his desires rather than the order of the world, and generally to believe that there is nothing entirely in our power except our own thoughts. He thus sounds very resigned and accepting of things as they are. But, he concludes, fourth and finally, after surveying the diverse occupations, professions, ways of life human beings undertake, he could do no better than spend his whole life cultivating his reason. Unlike past philosophers, however, his contentment did not result merely from his training himself to restricting his desires to what he could accomplish. His extreme contentment arose from his daily experience of discovering important truths, commonly unknown to others by means of his method. So he was really exploring and adding to knowledge. So from November 10th, 1619, when he considered his future plan of action, until 1628, when he moved to Holland, Descartes says he had not taken a stand on any of the issues debated by the learned. But hearing he was reputed to have articulated the certain foundations of philosophy, he decided that he should publish his thoughts. He hadn't been seeking glory or reputation, but he wasn't indifferent to his standing in the eyes of others. His desire to make himself worthy of the name he had acquired thus led him, in effect, to move from monarchical France to retire in a country, Holland, where the long duration of the religious war has established such order that the armies maintained there seem only to enable one to enjoy the fruits of peace with more security, and where amid the throng of a great and very active people, more concerned with their own affairs than curious about those of others, he could live as solitary and retired a life as in the most remote deserts, while lacking none of the conveniences of a big city. There, living in obscurity, he could safely complete and publish the results of his studies, but even so, he initially published them anonymously. And I have read that he was so worried about the authorities that he moved 20 times a year, every year. He didn't want to be found. Considering the discovery of the first principles of philosophy to be the most important thing in the world, because all other sciences depend on them, in part 4 of the Discourses, Descartes relates the thoughts, which led him to find the character and ground of certain knowledge. Acknowledging that such metaphysical inquiries are not to everybody's taste, and he was writing a popular book, he presents very, very brief versions of the arguments that persuaded him that it is possible to attain the search of knowledge. Although he recognizes that it is sometimes necessary to proceed on the basis of opinions one knows are dubious in making moral judgments and in action, in seeking truth, he had determined that it is necessary to do the opposite and to reject as absolutely false everything about which he had the least doubt in order to see whether something remained. Because our senses sometimes deceive us, we all know, he chose to believe that nothing is really as we imagine it to be. Having observed that human beings often make mistakes in reasoning and judging that he was also liable to do this, he also rejected all the reasonings he had previously been taken to be proofs, as, for example, in geometry. And finally, considering that the same thoughts we have while awake may come to us while we are sleeping without being true, he regarded everything in his mind to be no truer than the illusions of his dreams. He immediately realized, however, that there was one thing he could not doubt. He thus pronounced the truth. I think, which includes doubting, therefore I am. That was the indubitable first principle of the knowledge he was seeking. Descartes' description of his conclusion makes it sound as if the I, or the soul, by which he is, refers to him as an individual, the man who wrote these words, usually thought to be embodied. But there is, in fact, nothing personal about his proof that he, in quote, exists. In the Discourse, Descartes claims only to have discovered what in general is required for a proposition to be true and certain. Whatever one conceives clearly and distinctly as he had his own existence while he was thinking, and I might add, and only while he was thinking, although he doesn't add that in the Discourse. Descartes explains his second fundamental metaphysical principle by reflecting that the fact that he is doubting shows that he, or his mind, is not perfect or complete. For example, he doesn't possess complete knowledge. He thus asks, where could he have gotten or acquired the idea of something more perfect, which does have that knowledge? That idea couldn't come from the things around him, because he didn't observe anything around him that was superior to him. His ideas concerning such things depend on his own nature. If they are true, it is because of some perfection in him. If not, they're products of some defect in him. reasoning that something cannot come from nothing, and that it is no less contradictory for something more perfect to come from something less perfect, although both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke go to town with that. You can add or subtract. Descartes concludes that his idea of a perfect being had to come from such a being outside of him. The ideas he has of sensible, corporeal things might be mistaken, but he cannot deny that he has these ideas, even if they're mistaken. He has already recognized very clearly in himself that intelligent nature is distinct from corporeal or bodily nature. Considering all composition to be a sign of dependence and dependence to be a defect, he argues, God cannot be a composite of two natures. God has to be purely intelligent. And if there are bodies in this world or other intelligences or natures, their being must depend on his power. Relying on Anselm there. Seeking other truths, Descartes then turned to the object of the geometers, which he conceived to be a continuous body or space, indefinitely extended in length, breadth, and height, divisible into different parts, having different figures or magnitudes, which can be moved or fragmented in all sorts of ways. Going through some of the geometer's simpler demonstrations, he noted that the great certainty everyone attributes to their proofs is founded only on the fact that they're evidently correct, logical. However, looking back to examine the idea he has of a perfect being, he found that existence is contained in it, the same way the idea of a triangle mandates the equality of 3 angles to 2 right angles. A perfect being would necessarily be. It is therefore at least as certain as any demonstration in geometry that God, who is this perfect being, is or exists. The reason many people find it difficult to know God or what their soul is that they are so accustomed to consider nothing except by imagining and bringing a picture to the mind, that whatever is not imaginable, that is, doesn't have a shape or a body or a color, seems to them unintelligible, purely intelligible. Descartes would have liked to have continued and showed the whole chain of other truths he had deduced from his first 2 metaphysical principles. But recognizing that he had already made claims that would arouse very serious controversies, and they did, among the learned, he contents himself merely with summarizing the contents of a treatise he had just completed, but decided not to publish after he heard about the trial of Galileo. In this treatise, Descartes admits, he presented a very different account of the creation of the world than that to be found in Scripture. But, and I quote, he did not want to infer that this world had been created in the manner he proposed, for it was indeed more probable that God had made it from the beginning, such as it was to be. Ironically relying on an opinion commonly received among theologians, that the action by which God now conserves the world is entirely the same as that by which he created it, Descartes feels justified in concluding that although God first created chaos, by having established the laws of nature, which later in the discourse Descartes identifies with the laws of mechanics, God lent assent to its acting as it customarily does. So all God does is set everything in motion. Descartes asserts that he has simply made the character of the natural order easier to conceive by showing how it developed little by little. In fact, however, he has substituted his non-mysterious account of the genesis and nature of the physical world, based entirely on reason, for that to be found in Genesis. Turning from his studies of nature as a whole to the bodies of animals, and particularly human beings, Descartes acknowledges that he did not yet have enough knowledge to speak of them in the same style as the rest. That is, by demonstrating effects by causes and showing in what manner nature must produce them. He had contented himself with assuming that God formed the body of a human entirely like one of ours, without putting into it at the beginning any reasonable soul. Descartes uses the circulatory system as an example to show how the human body can be described as a marvelously constructed machine whose functioning can be perfectly, that is, completely explained on the basis of the organization of its organs, without reference to our thinking or having a soul. Other mammals also act as they do as a result of the structure of their bodies. But lacking an immaterial soul or mind, they cannot see words or other signs by putting them together to declare their thoughts to others. They can't speak. They may be able to do many specific things better than we: fly, run, smell, jump, love their masters. But they cannot change the behaviors dictated by their bodily structure in order to respond to varying circumstances, the way human reason enables us to change our behavior. Descartes explains that he has dwelt on the soul because, and I quote, "After the error of those who deny God, there is none that leads weak minds further from the strict path of virtue than to imagine that the soul of beasts is of the same nature as ours, and that consequently we have nothing to fear or to hope for after this life." However, when we understand the reasons that our soul is of a nature entirely independent of the body, and consequently that it is not subject to dying with the body, seeing no other causes that can destroy it, we are naturally led to judge that it is immortal. Naturally led to judge, but he doesn't actually say that in his own name. Descartes thus reminds his readers that he is concerned about the moral as well as the intellectual effects of his search for certain truth. He has not only articulated methodological rules for conducting that search, he also formulated a provisional morality, the first maxim of which was to obey the laws and customs of his country, adhering constantly to the religion in which God had graced him to be instructed. He does not confess in the discourse that he agreed with Galileo's defense of Copernicus's heliocentric theory, although the posthumously published treatise that he had suppressed shows that he did. 3 years later, he published the discourse, concluding with an account of the internal debate, that is, the debate he had with himself, which led him to do so. So long as the results of using his method served only to satisfy him with regard to certain difficulties in the speculative sciences, and trying to regulate his morals while he did, he didn't think he was obliged to publish anything. But as soon as his investigations of nature convinced him, and I quote, "It is possible to attain knowledge that is very useful for life," which is the kind of knowledge he went to college hoping he would acquire, he changed his mind. He did not think he could keep the results of his investigations hidden without gravely sinning against the law that obliges us to procure the general good of all men as much as we can. He promises that acquiring this knowledge would make people masters and possessors of nature, able to invent an infinity of artifices that would enable us not only to enjoy the fruits of the earth without pain or much effort, but also to conserve our health. And he explains, health is without doubt, the primary good and foundation of all other goods of this life. For even the mind is so dependent on the temperament and arrangement of the organs of the body that if it is possible to render men wiser and more capable than they have been up to now, the means of doing so must be sought in medicine. Acknowledging that there is little known of that science at his time, he plans to devote the rest of his life to finding it. He's relatively young and thinks he will infallibly find the knowledge he seeks by using his method, unless he is prevented by the brevity of his life or lack of experiments. Descartes explains that he has published the discourse in an effort to overcome these two impediments, short life or lack of experiments, by communicating to the public the little he has learned and to urge good minds to try to go further by contributing to the experiments required. He would have liked to have conducted all the experiments himself, or at least to have supervised them. But he discovered that he cannot complete his study by himself. He needs the assistance, again, of good minds, all the good minds he can recruit. So he attached 3 examples of the kinds of studies he wished to encourage to the discourses. On subjects he expects not to provoke much controversy or to oblige him to declare more of his principles than he desires. So he admits, in effect, that there's something held back here. A long chain of causes and effects can be deduced from the first principles he has explained, that is, his existence and God's. But he has deliberately not shown how to prevent certain minds who imagine that they can know in one day what another, namely Descartes, has spent thinking about in 20 years as soon as he has told them a word or two. They will try to build some extravagant philosophy on what they believe to be his words, for which he will be blamed. So he wants followers, but he's worried about his followers not understanding him. In concluding the discourse, Descartes thus clearly states that he has presented his thought in a way to prevent the 2 kinds of weak minds he mentioned at the beginning from thinking they can understand it. But those who read the studies he has appended to it, which very few readers do today, will see that he is introducing a new understanding of the way in which seekers of truth must reason. They must not, like scholastic philosophers and theologians, seek first causes from which they deduce everything. They must instead begin with the effects, our perceptions, which they observe, or from which they observe, and infer the causes which are improved by the effects. In distinguishing human beings from animals by the fact that we have minds, Descartes appears to reaffirm the traditional definition of the human as the rational animal. However, as indicated by the title, in his discourse, Descartes intends to introduce a new mode of reasoning that humans can employ, not merely by using words or logos, but in devising ways of meeting challenges to our existence that are not mandated by the organization of our bodies, as the actions of other animals are. Although Descartes continues to regard all enterprises conceived and directed by a single mind superior to incremental developments, he sees that the truths he now seeks can be discovered only by conducting and compiling the results of many empirical experiments. He would have liked to have conducted, or at least to have supervised all of the experiments, but he recognized that he can't. He writes primarily to attract other strong minds to devising, executing, recording, and communicating the results of the experiments they undertake as a result of reading his writings. He is also trying to divert, if not assuage, his scholarly critics, and there were many almost immediately, as well as to solicit public support for funding the new schools and laboratories in which these experiments will need to be conducted. Descartes did not live to see his revolutionary educational project realized, but we who study in research universities and enjoy the benefits of modern medical technology live in the world he first envisioned. Thank you. Of course. Yes.
I wanted to ask you, because as you pointed out in the historical context, he was very concerned with how his work would be received existence, because it seems like he was saying things that he didn't some things that he didn't necessarily believe to be true to placate authorities.
Simple question, Captain.
I mean, no debate about it whatsoever. I myself am not certain, so this is not certain knowledge, that Descartes thought there was a God. But when you have to ask, so what did he mean by God? Because the God he describes is really not the one who declares with a word that separates the waters and creates land, animals, and things in the heavens. This God is the power that maintains things in being. So you could say being instead of God. And if you say that, then Descartes thought, yes, there is being. And he also thought there is intelligible being. But he lived at a time in which he himself had inherited enough money that he didn't have to work for a living. So he could devote himself to study. But in order to study and to talk to other people who did, you needed to be in the university. And in Europe, the universities were controlled by the schoolmen who were theologians. In France, Catholic. In Holland, where he was, he managed, within a year of publishing the Discourse, to get in trouble, serious trouble, with the Calvinist theologian who was rector of the University of Utrecht. And that theologian managed to have Descartes' writings, or Descartesian philosophy, the teaching, proscribed, and that prescription stayed on the books until 2005. So Descartes was not crazy. I mean, he faced a problem because he thought he had made a great discovery. And he had made it, I mean, as he explains it in the Discourse, on the one hand, he discovered enough to know, this is what I want to devote my entire life to. And I'm going to live by myself, almost in isolation. So I can do these studies, but I can't do all of them. So I have to get people to cooperate with me. And he had a luminous correspondence. He had a lot of friends. I think he was a better friend in writing letters than in person, but Professor Warner can comment on that, because he knows a lot more about it. But so Descartes was dedicated to what he was doing because it was the most satisfying thing he had found. But he also knew he was marching into a headwind. He was challenging, and he knew he was challenging the way all the professors in all the universities certainly were teaching philosophy. This was a really fundamentally new way of conceiving the world that he was proposing. And so his texts, not just this one, but the meditation, he wrote them in such a way that he was trying to pacify the Catholic theologians. So he wrote to a friend of his, Father, and saying, well, I hope the theologians of the Sorbonne, to whom he dedicated the meditations after this, don't notice how much I am moving away from Aristotle until they accept the arguments. But he comments in that book that there's no reason, the human beings can't know final causes, and we can't know formal causes. So for Descartes, all there were efficient and material causes. But that's not what he said. This is the method of understanding the world and reasoning about it, and the first thing you have to understand is throw Aristotle out. Because he was quite sure that Descartes would be thrown out first step. But that means for us reading his books later, we have to sort out, or try to sort out, what's rhetoric intended to put off his critics, and what's Descartes' fundamental thought.
So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you put it in.
Descartes questions everything. So, his first principle, which is, I think, therefore I am, he's also questioning that. So, how does he move from questioning everything to being sure about something? And what does this tell about like gaining truth and knowledge?
Okay, so that's not what he tells us. He doesn't tell us in the discourse how he got it from it. He tells us that he had, thinking about it, he knew he was doubting, he knew he was questioning. And he couldn't deny, I mean, there are a lot of arguments about it. He couldn't deny that he was doing it while he was doing it, because he was aware that he was doing it. The trick is that, unlike English, in a lot of languages, you can have verbs, like thinking, that carry a subject with them. But all he was doing was saying, while thinking. There's no other definition of that I except the thinking. The thinking was going on, so he couldn't think and say it wasn't. And then he goes from that, okay, so I have thought now. But the character of my thought is doubting, questioning. Where did I get the idea that there could be something, someone, who has the knowledge that I'm seeking, that doesn't doubt, has overcome doubt, because that's what he wanted. He wanted sure knowledge, so he wanted to overcome his knowledge. And he thought, well, that come from me. So it has to come from outside of me. And coming from outside of me, the cause of that thought has to exist, because it's perfect knowledge of complete being. And those are his two metaphysical, because they're not corporeal principles. What he then says is, oh, I'd love to tell you how I got from those to my method, and how I got from those to what is an explanation, it's not very technically expressed, of the world as matter and motion. But I can't do that here. I've done that in this treatise that I call The World. And so in there, I tried to show how you go from light to heavenly bodies, to motions on the surface of the earth, to plants, to animals, living things. So he put them all in order, which is kind of the way the scriptural account is. But knowing that Galileo had been tried by the Inquisition and was in jail and could have been killed for maintaining that things don't circle around the earth, Descartes said, I didn't publish. He didn't feel comfortable publishing the book. He gives a fuller explanation of that in the later book he did publish, called The Principles of Philosophy, where he begins to reason and goes on. But even there, he says about this book, wrote to a friend of his, Hawkins, that he was trying to express his thought in a way compatible with the scholastic tradition, so that he would get a hearing by the theologians. And he admits in the Meditations, which is later, he didn't prove the immortality of the soul. And he goes on to say, well, now that I've shown that we can have certain knowledge, and I've shown that God exists, now we could recognize that what are human beings? Human beings, not God. Combinations of body and soul. He says that's the true man in the discourse. And then he says that's the whole man. But he postponed talking about how the body and soul are related in a human being until what became his very last work, The Passions of the Soul. correspondence. So Descartes, so the discourse was published in 1637, the Meditations are published in 1641, the Principles of Philosophy in 1647, I think.
44.
44, okay, French translation.
47.
In 1643, a woman, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, had been reading Descartes' Meditations, and so she wrote to him and she says, I don't understand how the mind, if it's so separate from the body, can move the body, or how the body can move the mind. And he said, well, you don't understand because I wasn't writing about that. I first wanted to establish the separation. And then, having established the separation, in the Passions of the Soul, he tried to show how the body affects the mind, and how the mind can affect the body indirectly, not directly. You can't order your body to think. There are lots of the parts of Descartes' physiology that people no longer accept, but they do accept the general principles of it. To get how it really works, you have to include Newton and Leibniz and some calculus, modern physics, etc. It's really important, I think, as an innovator, changing the way we think about things rather than supplying all the results. Yes?
Concerning how he changed the way I think about things, there's so much legend about how he changed math and science and how he inherited those truths, but it's not always spoken of how he might have changed the way, it's not always spoken how he shaped our political dispositions, for example. So, Tocqueville would describe in Democracy of America the philosophical method of the Americans. And also refer to Descartes as the greatest democrat. But we don't really hear about that. Could you perhaps tell us a little more of how he pertains to our side of the Atlantic and has been around us, and how we might also be walking in his footsteps despite him marching along?
Okay, that's tall order, the proof of God, and now how
I
I'll try, but it'll be inadequate. This is why I emphasize the way in which Descartes tries very strongly in the Discourse, which is his first published writing, to downplay the revolutionary character of his thought. So it's better to have one mind design it. And Descartes thought it would be better for Descartes to design the experiments and to teach everybody how to think, but he saw that he couldn't do that. What he had to do most immediately, at least as he saw it, was to change the way people were thinking, because what you think, your opinions, affect how you act. He was writing and living, certainly in France, where he was educated in a very hierarchical society, but that was true even in the Netherlands. And in both places, if he had said, the governments are unjust, and we should have a revolution and make the governments immediately responsible to the people, he wouldn't have been around to write many more words. So in the Discourse, he fronts, I'm obeying the law. I am following the religion of my country, which is imposed by law. I'm not advocating violence. All I'm doing is I'm trying to change the way you think. But the way he was trying to change thought was no longer to study all the old books, no longer to learn Greek and Latin, no longer to study the history of philosophy. Little history was okay, but it's really just a story. What we want to learn is how things work, what's useful, which really appeals to, as Tocqueville says, pragmatic Americans. And this is simpler. I'm simplifying. There are 4 rules of my method. That's all you need to know. And you don't need to know another language in order to learn them. So there is an implicit democratization of thought, as indicated by his first, well, everybody's satisfied with his own opinion. Of course, Descartes really didn't believe that, but he did think that all human beings had this power of reason. And what he wanted to do was to redirect it from these old, scholarly, philosophical, historical, literary studies to practical scientific experiments recorded upon which people could build incrementally. So he's pointing to not elite education. He's calling for big public institutions in which, publicly funded, more people can go, and in which we amass the results of a lot of different experiments and studies. For what purpose? Making life more comfortable, safer, and more enjoyable. Not just for the guys who own all the property, but for everybody. So what does he think about political rules? He doesn't say very much explicitly. There's a little bit, so you should try to benefit everybody. But implicitly, this is simplifying making education more open and dedicating it to not, he wanted knowledge for its own sake, I think. But that's not what he thought these institutions would be. They would be dedicated to acquiring knowledge that would make life for everybody longer and better. And so what Tocqueville says is not that everybody studies in America. Descartes never read a word. But it comes with now the new mores and the new opinions.
Follow-up to this. So are you saying that the utility, concern with utility is rhetorical? Because
Am I saying what?
that the concern with utility is rhetorical? Or how do you know that it's not, given that you say partly it is? It's not what he really believed for himself,
Well,
for others,
okay, so
especially in
I
a
was-
Christian society.
Well, because I think if you want support of other people, he concludes with what good supporting his educational project. And this really is, to a certain extent, a substitution of education for politics or for force. See, if you teach people to proceed in a different way and to get better results, you're no longer taking from some in order to enrich others. But the reason why I think that Descartes doesn't think that for himself is when his provisional morality, when he says, and so he says it has 3 or 4 maxims, and so it's not clear that the 4th is, he could count. It's not clear that the 4th is really a maxim. But he says, so I looked around, traveled for 9 years, going around, people and asking questions. I had concluded that the life of philosophy and reason was the best for me. So that was what I was going to do. And what made it best? Not all these benefits that other people were going to get, but I discovered new and important truths every day. That's not, I mean, you couldn't read the text the other way and weigh it, but I think he gives a hint of what moved him as opposed to what he thought would move other people to follow his lead.
And that is not revolutionary. To that limited extent, not revolutionary.
That limited extent, what?
It is not revolutionary. It's the
Oh, well-
philosopher in the classical sense.
Okay, that thought is not revolutionary. You know, that you have to appeal to people with something they would like in order to persuade them. Yeah. Yes.
Could you elaborate on why Descartes believed that what he thinks are to be true is a perfection in him, and an opposite is a defect in him?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you elaborate on why Descartes believed that what he thinks are believed to be true was perfection in him, and what he believes, or what turned out to be false with defect in him?
Okay. So what Descartes finds that he can't doubt is that he has these mental operations. They're things in his mind, and he calls those things or thoughts ideas. And so he says, the ideas can be true or false, but I can't doubt that they're in my mind. So then how could it be that they could be both true and false? Well, if his mind has the capacity to register or discover true things, then his ideas will be true. But in doubting, he's already admitted that he recognizes that he makes errors and that our senses, you see things, but you don't see them in the right perspective, or they aren't the way you see them if you move away or you move closer. So our senses deceive us. And you get a cold enough thing and it will burn you if you touch it. So he thinks himself this combination in his mind of true and false things. So he says, so it's all what he can do, his mind. It's not the things themselves. But he has an idea that there could be a mind that perceived everything correctly. And that's the mind he identifies with God. And that mind is not in a body as Descartes knows his own is, and that mind doesn't die as Descartes knows he will. But what Descartes did, in contrast to the history of philosophy that precedes him, is that he first asked and concentrated on what we human beings can know, rather than asking what's out there that we can know. So there's a huge change in the focus of knowledge. Again, well, okay.
So what you just said, this is how Descartes focuses on self-examination, looking into oneself. So doesn't this contradict philosophy? Isn't it in some way contradicts what philosophy is and what philosophy methodology? Doesn't it contradict it?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. That's
doesn't this contradict philosophy? This focus on self-examination?
Okay. That's not everybody's understanding of philosophy, as self-examination. So there are authors not as well known who used to be called pre-Socratic and now are called early Greek philosophers. And they asked about being, or what is the material out of which everything is made. And so it's Socrates who started the search for self-knowledge in philosophy. Augustine made that self-examination, or But Socrates' way of seeking self-knowledge was then to go out and question the opinions of others. So it wasn't just in the self for Socrates. And the opinions of others, of course, had to do with things in the world itself. Because ultimately, if you ask what kind of a being you are, you have to do it comparatively with other things. So Socratic philosophy is one form of philosophy, but it's not the only form. Epicurus, for example, in definition, the best life is the life of pleasure, and that's the absence of pain. But it doesn't have this kind of inward focus. And actually, I think Descartes sounds as if his philosophy has this inward focus. Augustine's faith is based on an inward examination. But Descartes seeks certain knowledge, and he says, certain principle you can't think, doubt, and say there's no thinking or doubt. But establishing that and the existence of God or being outside. So you're not just a mind in the past, as people here would say. He then turns to redefining what we can know of the world in terms of this conception of the geometers. So everything is extension and the movement of various sized particles in extension. That's not the way you encounter the world until you go into a laboratory. And it's not the way I see it. And that's not really self-examination. So I guess in this respect, I think Bernard Williams is correct when he argues that what Descartes does in the discourse and the meditations is to find this first principle of certain knowledge. And then, having founded that, he expands. But it's no longer focused on itself. So,
Let me expand on Mohammed's question. Very good question, I think. After he concludes or comes to the view, I think, therefore I am, he says, thus I found the first principle, not of certain knowledge, the first principle of philosophy that I was seeking. That's a peculiar first principle of anything, much less a first principle of philosophy, because it is so, to put it simply, subjective. And I think what Mohammed's question is trying to get at is how could arriving at a judgment that only says something about oneself, when oneself is involved in a certain activity, that somehow that's the beginning of philosophy.
well, I don't think that it's the self that's involved in that. That's how.
But so, yeah, say more about it.
Okay, all right. I did make this ball plain, and this is a much read text and people read it differently. But what Descartes maintains is that obeying the principle of non-contradiction, he couldn't doubt that he was doubting. So what can't be doubted is the doubting. That's a subjective principle, but it would be true of anyone who has a mind that doubts. So it's not Descartes as an identifiable individual or self. It's somebody involved in this intellectual, not corporeal according to Descartes. It's a purely intellectual activity. And anyone engaged, I say I can't speak without a subject, but it's really not about the subject, it's the activity. Thinking can't deny thinking is in some sense. Because you have to stop thinking. I mean, so there is this activity that can't deny itself. And then I'm using the self in the reflexive meaning of the pronoun, not as something instantiated, a self. I think just that help.
Can you explain what you mean by subject? So the thinking the subject, which is
Okay, so in a very simple sentence, I could say, I talk. So the I is the subject, the person who's doing the talking. But talking can go on without me. You can talk, he can talk. Talking is talking. And you can't imagine, you can't conceive of talking and not admit that at least this thing is going on, the activity. So what I'm trying to distinguish is Descartes is saying the activity exists, not, he hasn't shown that there is necessarily a separate subject doing thinking or the talking or the running. But it is something that he has to say indubitably exists. So you can begin there. And I think Descartes is redefining what philosophy means. When he says that. And I think pretty self-consciously.
But when he says that, it's surprising.
Okay, or writes it.
One might expect him, after he distinguishes between this I, the je, you see that, je pense, je suis. After he does this, one might have expected him to say the I, the je, is a mind. Because he's made his way into this by saying he can feign that he doesn't have a body, he can't feign he doesn't have a mind. But then he says, the soul by which I am what I am, je suis ce que je suis, which is the French translation of Exodus 3:14. When Moses says to Yahweh, who shall I say is sending me to save the people of Israel? Yahweh says, I am who I am.
I've been told it is actually, I will be what I will be. But that's,
The Hebrew doesn't distinguish between the two,
okay,
right? It can mean one or it can mean the other.
I can't answer that.
Yeah.
No comment.
But in the Vulgate translation of Saint Jerome,
Yeah.
it's ego sum qui sum, which translates je suis ce que je suis.
Yes.
So he introduces the soul there without defending that he's a soul or giving any argument, but he does say he is what he is because of the soul that he has. But it comes straight out of Exodus, which is, I think, peculiar and needs some kind of analysis.
Okay, I've been arguing for the proposition that Descartes tried to package a very unconventional way of thinking in conventional and religious terms. And so he uses terms from the Bible to express what he's saying. But he's not saying, for example, that he's Yahweh. So it's new wine in old bottles or skins. I think he uses the Bible that way when he says, oh yes, it's more probable that Genesis gives us an account of how the world was really created instead of this more materialistic scientific account I've given. I've just made it easier to understand. But it's not the same. And likewise, the autobiographical character of the discourse, as well as the meditative form of the Meditations, the two works in which he announces this fundamental principle that I can't doubt, that I exist, that I'm doubting. That confuses the character of what he's maintaining. And he certainly doesn't, he doesn't distinguish there. There's a place in the Meditations that he says the same thing about the one man being the soul. But Descartes doesn't really explain, so far as I know, you could know better, the difference between the soul and the mind. He doesn't claim that the mind, well, is it eternal or not? He admits that he can't show that the soul is immortal. Is the mind immortal? Well, it's not material, but because it would be, well, not just dangerous, it probably causes death for him to say publicly and openly things that so contradicted accepted religious beliefs.
I feel like throughout the discourse there's kind of, we talked about it a little bit today, I think there's kind of this maybe conflict between really individualistic notions and more collective ones. So sometimes he says that you know, houses and cities that are designed by multiple architects lack perfection. Sometimes, like in part 6, he says that, you know, the utility that others would receive from the communication of my thoughts would not be very great because they wouldn't understand them as well as if they had come to understand it themselves. But then earlier in the very same chapter, he was saying the reason that we want to publish this sort of thing is so that people could kind of collectivize this knowledge and work together to increase it bit by bit. And he also says that, you know, people who follow one master are like ivy growing on a tree, you know. So can you talk about kind of this tension between really individualistic notions and more collective?
Well, I'm assuming you mean in Descartes because
Yeah,
it's
not in general.
So a part of the rhetorical challenge I think Descartes saw himself facing was, it's easier now with hindsight. He was a real genius. He was. I mean, he had an extraordinary mind and he recognized that himself early. But he didn't have a possessive feeling about the truths or discoveries he had made. So he was willing to, not only willing, I mean, he was trying to communicate that to other people. I don't think he was trying to communicate it so much, I don't see any evidence, and maybe it's my blindness, of course, that he thought he needed the confirmation of people agreeing with him. He thought he had found the truth and that other people would want to know that. But he also knew that it's very, very difficult to understand the truth about what we can know, what we can't know, the truth that he was trying to explicate. So one of the many things he was trying to do was not only to fend off the censors, he was also trying to communicate at different levels to different readers. And so he emphasizes, I think, the benefits in general. But in that last part, in part 6, one of the things that you're seeing and pointing out is that he engages in a kind of dialectical argument, in which he first says, well, I thought I should publish for this reason. But then I thought I shouldn't publish because the misunderstandings of what I'm trying to say may have worse effects than my just keeping it to myself. But I can't just keep it to myself because I, as an individual human being, don't have the time, the resources, or the ability to conduct all of the experiments that will show this approach of mine will open up, in effect, a new world. So I somehow have to brave the problems that are associated with misunderstanding. And it's a really difficult task. I don't think that he achieved it entirely. Partly because this theologian at the University of Utrecht saw through what Descartes was doing immediately. So he says he's a subtle atheist in response to your first question. But he doesn't believe in God, and he's not teaching philosophy the way we do. So it's not philosophy. And it shouldn't be taught at this university. He was a Calvinist. In his next book, Descartes says, oh, well, I got a follower. There was a doctor of medicine at University of Utrecht who read Descartes, and he thought, this is great. I'm going to teach it. And that's what set off the record. So then Descartes writes the Meditations, and he dedicates them to the faculty of theology at the Sorbonne, with the hope that they will accept his book as a textbook to be taught at the university. Writes his friend, I hope they don't notice that I'm going so far away from Aristotle. They noticed, they never accepted it. That we're not idiots. So I think he was trying to do something that's very difficult. And probably we in the United States underestimate the extent to which adult human beings don't like to change their minds. You may have experienced that with your parents or others. And Descartes was trying to change minds, and he was trying to change. He had to get through people he knew didn't agree with him and had a stake in not changing the way philosophy was taught.
Please join me in thanking Professor Zuckert. One on the Quran and one on Montesquieu's Persian letters. I hope to see you then. Thank you very much.